We continue now at the top of Daf Tzadi Bezam and Bezam Meseches Zevachim. This is Zevachim Daf 92b. On the previous summit, the Gemara said that by chatos hachitzonos, outer chatos, and also chatos hapnimios, inner chatos, both of those involve animals. By both of those, if the blood gets on the garments of the kahuna, so then ton kibus, then the garments need to be laundered, but that is not true by chatos ha'of. And the Gemara says, why is that the case? The Gemara says there's an inclusion and there's an exclusion, and the reason why we know to include chatos hapnimios, the Gemara listed some things which chatos hapnimios have in common with chatos hachitzonos, and the Gemara continues the list. V'keren, it also requires application of the blood to the corner of the mizbeach. V'etzba, the application is done with the finger. V'chuda, it's along the edge. V'ishim, and it also requires the fire of the mizbeach. When it comes to the chatos ha'of, only the blood is applied to the mizbeach. Nothing is burned on the mizbeach, the rest is eaten. But the Gemara continues and says, Adarab, on the contrary, chatas ha'of havalelu rebuye, chatas ha'of should be included. There are also things that chatas ha'of has in common with chatos ha'chitzonos, shekein chutz kamosa, because it is outside, just like the chatos ha'chitzonos, va'achila kamosa, and also it's eaten. When it comes to the chatos ha'pnimios, those are entirely burned, and so therefore maybe we should include the chatas ha'of. And the Gemara says, Hanach nafishin, when it comes to the commonalities between the chatos hapnimios and the chatos hachitzonos, those are more, and so therefore again we include those and we exclude the chatos ha'of. And the Gemara continues with another answer to this question. Rav Yosef says Amar Kra, it's because the pasuk says Yochlena, it says to Yochalena to eat it. The full pasuk is Hakohen Hamachate Yochalena b'makom kadosh teyachel b'chatzar ol moed, and we understand that to mean lazu, this one, v'lo la'acheres, and not for another one, and therefore b'ne'echalos mi'et hakasav, meaning by the kinds of chatos which are eaten, we're excluding one of those, and so therefore the chatos ha'of is eaten, that's the one that is excluded. The Gemara says, well, v'ela zos lamali, if that's what it's learned from, so what do we need the word zos for? That was the exclusion on the previous Amud. And the Gemara says, Ilav zos, if not for the word zos, hava amina yochlena orche dekra, kamash malon. If not for the word zos, I would have thought yochlena is just the way the pasuk speaks. It doesn't really mean anything in terms of exclusion, and therefore kamash malon, that's what the word zos is teaching us, that we should use yochlena to define what is being excluded. And Rashi explains, yochlena lozuv lo acheres, yochlena choda mashma. The word yochlena sounds like one thing that's being eaten. Lomar means to say, bi'achas min hanechalos, by one of the kinds of chatos which are eaten. Kasafti locha inyan hazeh, I write over here this idea, again, of laundering the clothing which get the blood on them. V'lo b'chol hanechalos, but not by all of the chatos which are eaten. So nismato chatos ha'of shehi necheles, so therefore chatos ha'of is going to be the one that's excluded because it is eaten midvarim ha'amurim be'inyan. It's going to be excluded from what is mentioned in the parsha over here. Uma Amar Be'inyan Kibus Mariko Shtifa, and that's what's written in the parsha, is this idea of Kibus Marika and Shtifa, which again is the idea of laundering, the idea of rinsing, of washing, and so therefore again we're going to exclude the chatos ha'of. And Rashi continues, Orche Dekra, one might have thought that's just the way the pasuk is written. Shekol ha'inyan beloshen zen nemar. The entire pasuk is written in this fashion. Tishachen achatos bevesara midama, and so following the same pattern, Yochalena, and so therefore that's what one might have thought, and Zos is saying, no, there is an exclusion, and Yochlena tells us which one to exclude. And the Gemara continues, Rabba Amar, Rabba says, Amar Kra, the pasuk says, Asher Yaza, that is sprinkled, and therefore Bahazos HaKosim Medaber, we're talking specifically about the kinds of chatos which are sprinkled. And Rashi explains, Rabba Amar, Rabba says, Hai Pircha de Parachta, the question which was asked, Dilma Pnimios Nismatu, that maybe the inner chatos are the ones that are excluded, Mimiyuta de Zos, from the exclusion of Zos, Ikar Kibus Bepnimios Ksiv. What Rab is saying is that actually, when we talk about washing the clothing, that is by the inner chatos. The Asher Yaza, because what does it say? It says Asher Yaza, that which is sprinkled. Benizos HaKosim Medaber, by those kinds of karbonos which are sprinkled, meaning Vahainu Bepnimios, that's specifically the chatos hapnimios. Ksiv, it's written Bohen Hazah ala paroches. It says the word Hazah, sprinkling on the paroches. Aval bechitzonos, but by the outer chatos, Ein Kosav Hazah, doesn't use the word Hazah. Vechitzonos hu disravam yitoras, and according to this approach, it is the outer chatos which are included from the inclusion of Toras. That's Rabba's approach. But the Gemara continues and asks, and Rashi has the girsa of Hatana de Masnisin, but the Tana of our Mishnah phrases it, Afa Pishen HaKosim Medaber, Ela b'nechalos, that even though the pasuk is speaking about the nechalos, about the chatos which are eaten, so therefore clearly not speaking about the chatos hapnimios. And the Gemara says to that, that's le'inyan mariko shtifa. That's in terms of the issue of marika and shtifa, which is scouring and rinsing. That's talking about a situation where a vessel was used to cook the chatos, avolinyan kibus, but in terms of washing of clothing, asher yaza ksiv. There it says asher yaza, and again that is referring to the chatos hapnimios. But the Gemara continues and asks, Ihachi, if so, if you're going to say again that Asher Yaza, the main pasuk in terms of washing of clothing, washing of the garments, is talking about the inner chatos, Echad ha-necholos v'echad ha-pnimios, what does the Mishnah say? It says whether it's necholos or pnimios, it should be the reverse. Echad ha-pnimios v'echad ha-necholos miboile. It should be whether it's the pnimios or it's the necholos, because the pnimios are the main topic of the pasuk. And the Gemara says, Tani, that is what it should say. It should read in the Mishnah, Echad ha-pnimios v'echad ha-necholos, whether it's the inner chatos or whether it is the chatos which are eaten. But the Gemara continues and asks, Ihachi, if so, if we're including necholos again, chatos ha'of nami, the chatos ha'of should also be included in this halacha of the washing of the clothing if the blood gets on them. And to that the Gemara says, Miet rachmana zos, we have an exclusion in the pasuk of zos. But the Gemara continues, Ihachi, if so, chitzona nami lo, the outer chatos also should not be included because zos is an exclusion. And to that the Gemara says, Riba rachmana toras, the Torah has an inclusion with the word toras. And so again the Gemara asks, if so, umaro isa, how do you know which one to include and which one to exclude? And the Gemara says the same as it said above. Mistabra makes sense to say, chatos behema havale liribuye, we should include the chatos that involves the animal, meaning the outer chatos, shekein behema shchita safon v'kabolas kli, v'karen v'yetzba v'chuda v'ishim, because that has the following commonalities. It's an animal, it's slaughtered in the north, the blood is received in a vessel, it's on the corner of the mizbeach, the blood is applied with the finger, it's by the edge of the mizbeach, v'ishim, and again it's burned on the mizbeach. And the Gemara says, Adrab, on the contrary, chatos ha'of havalei l'ribuye, chatos ha'of should be included, shekein hazah kimosa, because that's hazah, that's sprinkled, just like the chatos ha'pnimios. And the Gemara says, Hanoch nefishin, the commonalities between the chatos ha'pnimios and the chatos ha'chitzonos are more of them, there are more commonalities, and therefore we include again the chatos ha'chitzonos. And Rashi explains, the Tan of the Mishnah says, even though the pasuk is speaking about necholos, alma ikar kra bechitzonos udechsiv. You see that the main pasuk is focusing on chitzonos. Upnimios mi toras israbu, and pnimios are the ones that are included from the word toras. And Rashi continues, Hachi kamar, this is what the Gemara means to say, even though there are things in the parsha that are talking specifically about chatos and necholos, umaynu mariko shtifa, and what's that? That's the part of the pasuk that refers to marika and shtifa, which is scouring and rinsing. Dahi dafka b'necholos, that is specifically by the chatos which are eaten. To samachle kol zachar b'kohanim yochalosa, that's what it says in the pasuk, that the male kohanim are going to eat it. But Rashi continues, Miu, nevertheless, le'inyan kibus, in terms of washing of clothing, echad ha'necholos ve'echad ha'pnimios, it's by both those which are eaten and the inner chatos v'ha'pnimios ikar, and it's the inner ones which are the main focus of the pasuk, da'asher yazek sibahu, because it says in the pasuk asher yazeh, as the Gemara mentioned, v'chitzonos mizos toras achatos, and then chitzonos are included from the inclusion of the pasuk zos toras achatos. The Gemara then said, Yachi, if so, the ikar b'pnimios ksiv, if the main pasuk's for the focus of the pasuk is on pnimios, why does it say whether necholos or pnimios? That sounds like what we're saying by necholos also applies, we're extending it to pnimios. That sounds like again that the necholos are the main focus of the pasuk and pnimios are learned from the inclusion. And then the Gemara said, if so, chatos ha'of nami, teisei mimashma usa chatos ha'of. Also, you should learn out from the understanding of the pasuk sharei af himin hanizos. That's also you sprinkle the blood. Dechsiv v'hiza. It says the word v'hiza over there. And then the Gemara said there are more commonalities between the chatos hachitzonos and the chatos hapnimios. And the Gemara continues, Boy Rabbi Avin asks the following question, Chatos ha'of shehichnis dama bitzavara. Let's say you have a chatos ha'of, a bird carving chatos, and the blood is brought into the Beis HaMikdash in the neck of the bird. Bifnim, it's brought inside of the Beis HaMikdash. Mahu, what would be the halacha in that situation? Tzavara kechli shares dami umif. So do we say that the neck of the bird is the same as bringing the blood of an animal in a klishares, if that blood is brought inside, it's disqualified. Is that the same by the blood of the chatas ha'of? Or maybe ketzavar behema, maybe it's considered like the neck of an animal, in which case we say that that is not the case. There's no disqualification. Midama amar achmana v'lo b'sara, because the pasuk says from the blood and not from the meat. And so therefore, again, by chatas ha'of, if it's hichnis dama b'tzavara, that's the question of Rabbi Avin. Rashi explains, chatas ha'of sheichnis dama b'tzavar b'fnim bein malika lahazoya. This is talking about between the malika and the sprinkling of the blood. Ma'u shetifsal mishum v'chol chatas asher yuva. Is there going to be a disqualification, again, from the pasuk of chol chatas asher yuva, that generally a chatas of the blood is brought into the Beis HaMikdash when it's not supposed to be brought in the Beis HaMikdash? That's a disqualification. Kechli shares dami. On the one hand, we could say that the neck of the bird is the same as kli shares. Sharei lo hozgaka v'kabolas kli, because there's no requirement of receiving the blood in a vessel by the bird chatas. V'zehu kela, that actually, this is the vessel. Umifsal b'hachnasas adam shechnisa b'chli lahechol, and that would be a disqualification by bringing it in, bringing the blood into the hechol in the vessel that is fit for it, which is the neck of the animal, or the neck of the bird in this case. Odilmar, maybe it's more similar to the tzavar behema. Uvehema shechnisa lifnim mishanishchata. Let's say an animal is brought into the mikdash after it's slaughtered, v'hotzia, and then it's taken out, v'kibel dama, and then the blood is received. Lo mifsala, actually in that case it's not disqualified. To me dama amar achmana v'lo shechnisu im besar. It says it has to be the blood, and not that the blood is being entered into the mikdash with the meat. And the Gemara continues, Tashma, come in here, the following proof. The Brisa says, Pirchasaf, the bird convulsed after the malika was done and its neck was pinched. And on its own, as it's convulsing, v'nichnas alifnim, it enters into the Beis HaMikdash, v'chazr, and then returns and goes back outside of the Beis HaMikdash, kshera. So in such a situation, it's kosher. And the Gemara says that implies the only reason there's no disqualification is because it went in on its own. Ha'ichnisa psula, but if the person would bring it into the Mikdash, so that already would be a disqualification. It implies that bitzavar, that if the blood is in the neck, that is a disqualification by the chatas ha'of. But the Gemara says v'lataimich, but according to your reasoning, gabe kodshei kodshim, by karbonos which are of the most holy, to katani, it says over there similar. It says there pirchasa, that if the animal is convulsing, when it comes to kodshei kodshim, they're supposed to be slaughtered in the north of the azara. So if after it's slaughtered, it's convulsing v'yatzel adarim, and on its own it goes to the south of the azara, v'chazra, and then it returns to the north of the azara, kshera. So it says that it's kosher in that situation, similar to what we say over here again by the case of the bird that goes into the Beis HaMikdash when it's convulsing. But there, are you going to make the same inference? Hahotzia psula, are you going to say that if you take it to the south of the courtyard, that would be a disqualification? That's actually not true, and so therefore you can't make such an inference. Ela hayotzta lechutzit strichale. Rather, what's necessary over here is to say that when it goes on its own, by the animal, when it goes on its own to the south, that's kosher. But if it goes on its own outside the azara, that would actually be a problem. And hachinami, here also, that's what's going on by the chatas ha'of. Yotzta lechutz tzrichale. What it's saying is that if the chatas ha'of, let's say it enters into the mikdash by convulsing, so that we say, in such a situation, we say, it's not a disqualification, but if on its own it would go outside of the azara, there would be a disqualification. That's the purpose of what the Brisa is teaching. And Rashi notes, by the case of the animal, it says, V'yotzta l'darom v'chazra, that the animal, when it's convulsing, it goes to the south of the azara, then it returns. Rashi says, Lav dafka nakat v'chazra, it doesn't have to specifically return, and it's actually kosher, even if it doesn't return. Elam mishum dekatani baba hi pirchasa v'yotzta l'chutz v'chazra psuli. The only reason why it says v'chazra, that it returns, is because of the other case, where it says if it's convulsing and leaves the azara and returns, it's psula, it's disqualified. The dafka nakat, there we want to specifically say that it returns. Lashmin and Ribusa to teach the Chiddush, the Afagav, the Chazra, that even though it returned Psula, it is still disqualified. So Naka Nami Gavik Sheira v'Chazra. That's why by the case where it's kosher, we use the word v'Chazra over there as well. And the Gemara continues, Boy Rabbi Avin asks the following question, Nishbach al haritzba v'yosva mahu, let's say the blood from the neck of the bird, it spills on the floor of the azara, and then it's gathered up with a vessel. What is the halacha? Is it just that the pasuk does not require a klishares when it comes to the bird karbanos? V'hilkach osva v'kosher, therefore if it's gathered up with a vessel, that wouldn't actually be a problem, it would be kosher. Odilma, or maybe, mifsal pasal be'rachmana klishares, maybe the pasuk is saying that a klisharis is disqualified when it comes to the karbanos of birds. V'hilkach osvo upasel. Therefore, if the person gathers it with a vessel, it actually will be disqualified. And the Gemara continues, Amar Rava. Rava says, Tashma, come in here the following proof. The Brisa says, Yachol yehei dam chata sa'of ton kibus. One might think the blood of the chata sa'of requires washing if it gets on the garments of the kahuna. Talmud lomar zos, the pasuk says zos, which is an exclusion. Now, v'isal gadaitach mifsal pasal be'rachmon, if it should enter your mind that the use of a vessel is actually a disqualification, so in this case, when we're talking about the blood getting on the clothing also count as a vessel. So typically, we should simply say that it's been disqualified by being in the airspace of the vessel, and we said that when blood is disqualified and it gets on the garments, in that situation, washing of the clothing is actually not necessary. And so therefore, you wouldn't have to say that the chata sa'of does not require kibus because it's a chata sa'of, because it's the blood of the chata sa'of. One would simply be able to say that there's no need for kibus, there's no need of washing the clothing, because it was in the airspace of the vessel, it was disqualified for that reason. And the Gemara says, Amar Rav Huna Breder Rav Yoshua. Rav Huna Breder Rav Yoshua says, no, it's possible there is no airspace. B'madbik kli b'tzavara. It could be a case where the vessel is going right up to the neck of the bird, meaning there is no airspace, it's direct, and therefore in such a situation, one might think that the garment needs to be washed, but again, since it's dam chata sa'of, that is not necessary. And Rashi explains, Nishbach al haritzba mitzavar ha'of. Again, if from the neck of the bird the blood spills on the floor of the azara, atzruche hudalo atzruche rachmana klishares. Maybe the pasuk just didn't require a klishares. Vitzavar didei hu b'makom klishares, and the neck of the bird is like the klishares. V'hilkach laosvo kasher lazos lemizbech. Therefore, one could gather it up and sprinkle it on the mizbech. To have a kinishbach min hakli al ritzba. That would be the equivalent of spilling from the vessel to the floor. V'yasafo, and then gathering it up. To kosher, it's kosher. Or again, maybe we would say no, it's disqualified because the use of any kli would be problematic. And the Gemara continues, Boy minei Levi, and the Shinuya Nuschos has Mei Rebbe. Levi asked Rebbe the following question: Nitas mi beged lebeged mahu. Let's say the blood, it sprays from one beged, from one garment to another beged. What's the halach in that case? Mi beged kamo idchile lekibus. Do we say that already when it gets on the first garment, so now it's pushed off, that blood can't be used to be applied to the mizbeach, because now that garment needs to be laundered, it needs to be washed? O dilma lo, or maybe we don't say that. Rashi explains, Nitas mi beged lebeged. Again, the blood goes from one garment to another garment. Bedam behema kamayri. Here we're talking about the blood from an animal. Idchile lekibus. So on the one hand, we could say that the moment it gets on the first garment, it's pushed off because that garment has to be washed. Vigora le mi nishbach min akli ala ritzba v'asafu. This would actually be worse than a case where first the blood was received in a vessel and then it spills on the floor. Then it is actually allowed to be gathered up. V'yachar kach nitas ala beged, and then it sprays onto a garment. To hasam, because there in that case it's obvious that the garment has to be washed. Kevan de kosher lizrika, since it is still kosher to do zrika with that blood. Roy lahazah karina bay. That's called fit for sprinkling on the mizbeach, and therefore in such a situation that certainly would require kibus. The garment would have to be washed. Aval al habeged, but it's different in this case. Here it gets on one beged first. There's kuke izkik lechibus. Now at that point that first garment needs to be washed. So this blood is now pushed away from ever being able to be used for hazah at this point. Velo karina be roy lahazah, that's not called fit for hazah. Velo boy kibus hayachron, and then the blood that gets on the second garment, that garment would not require washing. And the Gemara continues, Amar le, he said back to him, Zu she'ela, this is a good question, but the answer is ton kibus. The answer is that washing of the second garment is required, and miman of shach, that's either way you look at it. I osvo v'kosher, if you're going to say that it can be gathered up and be kosher, so ha-kosher, so then it's kosher, and kosher blood requires kibus if it gets on the garment. V'osvo apostle, and if you're going to say that it's gathered up and it's disqualified, but anok Rabbi Akiva svirale, I hold like Rabbi Akiva, Diyamar, because Rabbi Akiva says, Haisa lo shas ha-kosher, if the blood at any point was kosher for application to the mizbeach, v'nifsal adama ton kibus, and then it gets disqualified, so then again, the blood is still going to require being washed if it gets on a garment. And Rashi explains, Zu she'ela b'nichusa yafa sha'alta. He's saying this is a good question, v'ashivcha aleh, and I'm going to give you the answer. Osvo v'kosher, if we're going to say that we can gather it up and it's kosher, v'afal kav dizdakik lechibos. Now, even though the garment needs to be washed, lo batal mitoras dam, let's say you argue that it's not nullified from being considered blood, kol zman shelo kibso, as long as the garment hasn't been washed, v'havale kinishbach min hakli alaritz. But let's say you treat this blood like blood that's spilled from a vessel to the floor, which is kosher, but kosher, so then it's kosher blood. V'tona achron kibus, which would mean that the latter garment would require being washed. V'yimtim salam Hashem osvom in arishon pasul. And if you're going to say that if you would gather it from the first garment, it's pasul. Kedekasal gadaitach, like you thought, mishum dehuzkok lechibos botalim mitoras dam. Since the garment needs to be washed, this is no longer considered dam that can be applied to the mizbeach. But anok Rabbi Akiva svirally, I hold like Rabbi Akiva to Amar lakamon. He's going to say later on, haisol hashas hakosher lizrika. If there was a moment where it was good for zrika, v'nifsal damaton kibus, and then it was disqualified, the blood does require kibus, it requires being washed on the garment. V'hayin, in this case, hare mitchilaso bechlin eskavel. In this case, it was originally received in a vessel. V'haisalo shas kosher, it had a time when it was kosher. V'yachagach nifsal b'nefilaso al beged rishon, and then after that is when it became disqualified by falling on the first garment. And so then again, either way you look at it, that second garment will in fact require being washed, and we will continue with this discussion in the next video on Daf Tzadi Gimel Amud Aleph.